The club game for July is a refight of the Battle of Rorkes between British Empire and the Zulu Kingdom. We'll be using black powder rules with a few amendments to the standard rules to reflect the type of battle. And here we see the layout of Rorkes with the melee bag walls constructed and the British troops ready to receive the Zulu attacks. The initial Zulu attacks on the British garrison will follow the historical attacks that the Zulus actually made, but we'll assume that the first attack is not going to be completely successful. So as each wave of attack is pushed back, the Zulus will then have 3 further waves of attack to deploy, and each time they deploy a new wave of attack they'll have free deployment, so they don't actually have to attack from the same position each time. And here we see the Zulus are now beginning to move up on the British position, and we've got some riflemen up on a hill shooting down into Rorkes trying to cause a few casualties using rifles that they've probably picked up off the British dead at Isandlwana. The British troops in the garrison begin to fire back at the advancing Zulus. One of the rules that have been slightly amended from the standard black powder rules is the British fire rate, because the British units are not particularly big. They would usually be overrun by this amount of Zulus, so we've given them a little bit of a buff on their firing ability, so they're a little bit more powerful. They have a first volley bonus and a few extra dice to roll to try and kill a few extra of those Zulus that are coming in. I think if we just played the standard black powder rules, the British garrison would be overrun pretty quickly. We can see here that the Zulus getting up to the mealy bag wall and also up to the side of the hospital. But they're met with a pretty fierce fire, and the Zulus' first attack is not particularly successful. But the Zulus at the hospital do manage to break the side door down here and manage to enter the side of the hospital. Here we can see the Zulu attack on the opposite side of the outpost at the kraal, and here we can see the Zulus from the back attacking the storehouse and the cookhouse. All around the compound, British troops keeping up a fairly hot fire to keep the Zulus out, but they slowly begin to take casualties. The British characters that are in the game are also able to help take casualties off. Again, if the British troops become shaken and then broken too quickly, the command would collapse and the Zulus would win quite easily. And here we see the Zulus are now breaking into the hospital, and they've started to enter into the rooms and start to dig holes through the walls. Meanwhile, the British outside still keeping up a steady fire and starting to beat back 1 or 2 of the Zulu attacks. And here we can see a fairly large Zulu attack coming in from the back of the hospital past the cookhouse. And here we can see the interior of the hospital. We can see the Zulus just breaking in on the right hand side. But unfortunately for them, just as happened in the real battle, the hospital catches fire, which means they're unable to continue trying to break through the walls and come into the rear of the British position. So they've got to wait until that fire potentially goes out before they can get through there. First couple of Zulu attacks have been pushed back, and the Zulu commanders are now allowed to bring their troops back on in slightly different positions if they want to, so they don't have to follow the historical attacks. And here we can see the second Zulu attack at the front of the hospital coming in, but again he's met with a fairly hot fire from the British troops still behind the mealie bag wall. Here we see another Zulu attack coming in, and a little incident here where a soldier who's outside the compound in the loo suddenly decides he's going to make a break and try and get back into the compound. Just a little bit of a nod towards a couple of real instances in the battle where a couple of the British troops were caught outside the compound and returned the next day once the action was over. Here we can see more Zulus coming up to the British compound trying to get in. The fire in the hospital still rages, so there's still nothing they can do there in trying to break in. Here we can see the Zulus trying to break in on the storehouse, but again the British fire is keeping them back pretty consistently. But the British troops are beginning to slowly take casualties, so they're going to have to be a little bit careful, because I suspect if the Zulus do break in, then the whole complexion of the battle could change quite quickly. Zulus getting up to the mealie bag wall, but the British troops again keeping them off with a fairly consistent fire. And again the Zulus push back from the storehouse, not being able to push their way in and break down the door to gain entry as they did in the hospital. Zulus come back in for yet more attacks. The fire in the hospital still raging, so it is getting to its climax though. You can see that sort of the fire each time grows in its intensity, and it will eventually burn itself out. And here's an overview of the Zulu attacks, so we can see just how things are going on the whole of the battlefield. Fire still going in on the hospital. More Zulu attacks coming in on the storehouse. The Zulu commanders have really decided not to attack all at the same time, but they've tried to choose a couple of blind spots to get their troops in and gain entry to the houses. But unfortunately the British troops and their extra firepower is just managing to keep them off, and unfortunately is defeating the waves of Zulus as they come in. But they are making progress and getting onto the mealie bag walls each time, but they're just not causing enough casualties on the British troops to push them back to allow them to gain entry into the compound. Here we see another massive Zulu attack going in on the mealie bag wall just by the hospital, and another wave of Zulus comes in on the side where the corral and the storehouse is, again desperately trying to find a small gap in the British line, but the British are pretty much holding them up. But they are getting very close to being shaken, and if that happens the British garrison will become disordered and broken, and that will allow the Zulus to flood in and claim a victory. But again, here we see the British troops just managed to force the Zulus back from the storehouse, and by this time the last Zulu wave of attacks is beginning to peter out, and they form up just for one final effort and are going to come in for one big attack around the whole compound just to see whether they can break in. But once again, British meet them fairly hot and consistent firepower. And even though the Zulus have attacked everywhere all at the same time, they're still unable to break in through the doors and windows of the storehouse. And the British firepower is just a little bit too strong for them. And the last of the final Zulu wave of attack is beginning to be pushed back, which leaves Rorkes Drift firmly in British hands again, and a fairly comprehensive victory for the British Empire over the Zulu Kingdom. Even though they didn't break in, the Zulus did make a big attempt to get into the compound, and it was a fairly close fight at the end of the day.